The afternoon sun hung heavy and golden over the wide open fields of the valley, painting the long grass in shades of amber and wheat. It was a quiet time of day, a time for rest after hard work, and for a rancher named Timon, it was a moment of simple peace. He was a man in his late 20s, with strong hands from years of labor and a kind look in his eyes that spoke of a gentle spirit. His faith was not something he shouted about, but something he lived in the quiet way he cared for his land and his animals. Right now, those hands were busy mending a section of wooden fence that separated his thriving ranch from the neglected land of his neighbor, Mr. Phelps. The post was sturdy, the nails were straight, and Timon took pride in doing a job right. The only sound was the rhythmic thump-thump of his hammer and the distant lowing of his contented cattle. This silence was broken by the distinct, approaching rumble of a stagecoach. It was an unusual sound for this lonely stretch of road, which saw more horses than carriages. Timon paused his work, wiping a sleeve across his brow, and looked up. The coach, dusty and worn from long travel, came to a creaking halt not at the end of his own lane, but right in front of Mr. Phelps's property. This was even more unusual. Mr. Phelps was not a man who received visitors. The coach door opened and a young woman stepped down. She moved carefully as if her legs were stiff from a long journey. She was dressed in a simple, clean dress that had clearly seen better days, and she clutched a small, worn suitcase as if it contained all the treasures in the world. This was Emily. She was a young woman of 20 years, with eyes that held a mixture of hope and a deep, weary fear. She looked at the Phelps house, a place that needed a fresh coat of paint and a caring hand, then back at the stagecoach as it rolled away, leaving her completely alone in a place she had never been. She took a deep, shaky breath, smoothing down her dress, and walked with determined steps up the path to the front door. Timon watched, his hammer hanging forgotten in his hand. He knew about mail-order brides, of course. It was a practice some men in these isolated parts used to find a wife. But Mr. Phelps? The man was known for his sour temper and his inability to keep hired help for more than a week. He was a bitter man who complained about the sun being too bright and the rain being too wet. A feeling of unease settled in Timon's stomach as he saw Emily lift her hand and knock firmly on the door. There was a long pause. Then, the door swung open not with a welcome but with a jarring suddenness. Mr. Phelps stood there, a man in his 50s with a permanent scowl etched on his face. He did not smile. He did not offer to take her suitcase. He simply looked her up and down, his eyes critical and cold. Emily, trying to be brave, offered a small, hopeful smile and began to speak, though Timon was too far away to hear the words. Mr. Phelps's reply, however, was loud and clear, his voice cutting through the quiet afternoon like a crack of thunder. "You're not what I was expecting," he said, his tone flat and cruel. "You look too frail for real work. I was clear in my letters. I need a woman who can cook, clean, and chop wood without fainting. You're not her. This was a mistake." Emily's face, which had been so full of hopeful light just a moment before, crumpled. The color drained from her cheeks. "But sir," she stammered, her voice trembling, "I have nowhere else to go. The stagecoach has left. I spent my last penny to get here." "That is not my problem," Mr. Phelps interrupted, his voice harsh and final. "I ordered a sturdy wife and you are not what I paid for. You are of no use to me. Go away." And with those crushing, heartless words, he stepped back and slammed the heavy wooden door right in her face. The sound echoed across the two properties, a sound of utter rejection. For a moment, Emily stood completely still as if she had been turned to stone. The suitcase felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Then her shoulders began to shake. A quiet, broken sob escaped her lips, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She was utterly alone, abandoned on the porch of a stranger in a strange land, with no money, no friends, and no hope. She looked down the empty, endless road, and then at the vast, unfamiliar landscape, and true terror filled her heart. Timon had seen enough. A hot anger, rare for him, rose in his chest. It was one thing to be grumpy, but it was another thing entirely to be so cruel, to leave a young woman in such a dangerous and hopeless situation. He dropped his hammer into his tool belt and without a second thought, began to walk across the field that separated their lands. His long strides quickly covered the distance. He approached the Phelps property not with anger, but with a determined purpose. Emily heard his footsteps on the gravel path and flinched, turning around quickly. Her eyes were wide with fresh fear, thinking it was Mr. Phelps coming back to shout at her some more. When she saw Timon, a stranger, approaching, she took a frightened step backward, clutching her suitcase like a shield. Timon stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to scare her further. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft and calm. "My name is Timon. I live right next door." I saw what happened." Emily just stared at him, too shocked and upset to speak. More tears welled in her eyes. "I want you to know," Timon continued gently, "that what he did was wrong. It was a cruel and unchristian thing to do. No one deserves to be treated that way." He looked at her tear-streaked face and felt a deep pang of sympathy. "You can't stay here on this porch. It's not safe and you have nowhere to go. I have a small cottage on my ranch where my mother lives. It's a proper home. You could stay there with her for as long as you need. You'd be safe." Emily looked at him, searching his face for any sign of trickery or deceit. But all she saw was kindness and honest concern. He wasn't smiling falsely, he was simply stating a fact, offering a solution. Her options were non-existent. It was either trust this kind-eyed stranger or face a night alone in the wilderness. Swallowing her fear, she gave a small, hesitant nod. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. I would be very grateful." "Let me carry your case for you," Timon said, and he carefully took the small, heavy suitcase from her trembling hand. He led her away from the porch of rejection, across the field, and onto his own well-kept land. He didn't lead her to the main ranch house, but to a charming, small cottage with flower boxes under the windows, where smoke curled peacefully from the chimney. Inside, his mother, a warm and gentle woman with silver hair, was just setting a pot of stew over the fire. She looked up in surprise as they entered. "Timon? Who is this?" "Mother, this is Emily," Timon explained. "She's found herself in a spot of trouble and needs a safe place to stay. I told her she could stay here with you." His mother's eyes moved from her son's earnest face to Emily's pale, frightened one. She needed no further explanation. She immediately wiped her hands on her apron and came forward, her face softening with motherly concern. "Of course she can," she said without hesitation. "Come in, child, come in. You look worn out. Let me get you a bowl of hot stew. You must be starving after your travels." The kindness in her voice was the final straw for Emily's composure. Fresh tears, these ones of relief and gratitude, spilled down her cheeks. She was led to a chair by the warm hearth, and a thick blanket was wrapped around her shoulders. The simple, homely cottage felt like a palace after the cold rejection she had just faced. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the three of them sat at the small wooden table. They ate a simple meal of stew and fresh bread. At first, Emily was quiet, but slowly, encouraged by the gentle questions from Timon and his mother, she began to talk. She told them how she had come from a big city far to the east, where she had worked long hours in a noisy factory after her parents had passed away from a fever. She had been so lonely with no family left in the world. She had seen the advertisement for a mail-order bride and, praying for a better life, had taken a chance. Timon listened intently, his heart aching for her story. He then shared a little of his own. He spoke of his father, who had built this ranch with his own two hands, and how he had passed it on to Timon before he died. He spoke of his faith, how it was his rock and his guide, especially during the hard winters and lonely seasons. He believed that God had a plan for everyone even when the path was difficult to see. As the fire crackled and the night grew dark outside the cozy windows, Emily felt a feeling she hadn't felt in a very long time, a sense of safety. The man across the table was not just kind, he was good and steady. The fear that had gripped her heart on Mr. Phelps's porch began to loosen its hold, replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of something new. It was not love, not yet, but it was the first small seed of hope, planted in the rich soil of an unexpected kindness, and watered by shared faith and a simple, warm meal. The dawn that broke over the ranch the next morning was soft and new, its light creeping across the fields like a shy visitor. For Emily, waking in the small, clean room in the cottage, the first rays of sun brought not the terror of the previous day, but a profound and quiet relief. The bed was warm, the quilt was patched with care, and from the main room of the cottage came the comforting sounds and smells of Timon's mother preparing breakfast. It was a feeling of peace so deep it made her heart ache with gratitude. She did not linger in bed, however. A powerful sense of obligation mixed with a desire to prove her worth spurred her into action. She dressed quickly, made her bed with neat, precise corners, and joined the older woman, offering her help with the morning chores before the first spoonful of porridge was even served. This pattern of earnest helpfulness became the rhythm of Emily's new life. She was not a guest who sat idly by. She was a partner in the work of the homestead. In the mornings, she would help Timon's mother with the cooking, the baking, the churning of butter, and the meticulous mending of clothes. Her hands, though initially unaccustomed to some of the tasks, were quick and willing to learn. She discovered a joy in kneading dough until it was soft and elastic, in seeing a row of clean jars filled with preserved vegetables, and in the simple satisfaction of a floor swept clean. In the afternoons, when the heat of the day was at its peak, she would often venture into the large kitchen garden behind the main ranch house, pulling weeds from between the carrots and beans, and carefully watering the tender plants. It was in this garden that Timon often found her. His own work was never-ending, mending fences, tending to the cattle, repairing tools, and managing the vast, demanding land. But he found himself looking for reasons to pass by the garden, to check on the progress of the tomatoes or to see if the peas were ready for picking. He would stop and talk, his tall frame leaning on the garden gate. At first, their conversations were polite and practical. He would compliment the neatness of her rows of lettuce. She would ask a shy question about the different types of cattle in his field. They were like two shy birds, cautiously hopping closer, one tentative tweet at a time. But as the weeks turned into months, their talks grew longer and deeper. The summer began to fade, and the leaves on the trees at the edge of the property started to blush with hints of gold and crimson. One evening, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, Timon brought out his old, worn family Bible. He did not preach or lecture. Instead, he simply read a passage aloud, his voice steady and calm in the quiet cottage. He read about faith and hope and love. Emily, who had felt so far from God in her loneliness and fear in the city, felt the words sink into her soul like a gentle rain on parched earth. She began to share her own story more fully, not just the facts of her parents' passing, but the deep emptiness that had followed, the feeling of being utterly alone in a crowded world. Timon listened, truly listened. He did not offer easy answers, but he shared his own struggles, the loneliness he himself had felt running the large ranch by himself, the weight of responsibility, and how his faith had been the anchor that held him fast through every storm. He spoke of praying for a companion, a wife who would not just share the work but share the life, the dreams, and the quiet moments. As he spoke these words, his eyes met Emily's, and a silent understanding passed between them. The friendship that had been growing so steadily began to blossom into something richer, something warmer and more profound. The seasons turned fully, and the crisp air of autumn arrived. The garden was harvested, the fields were prepared for their winter rest, and the world was painted in a brilliant tapestry of red, orange, and yellow. It was on one such afternoon, with the sky a clear, brilliant blue and the leaves crunching softly underfoot, that Timon asked Emily to walk with him down to the creek that bordered the far edge of his property. It was a beautiful, peaceful spot where the water bubbled cheerfully over smooth, round stones. They walked in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the gurgling water and the call of a distant bird. Timon stopped, turning to face her. His heart was beating loudly in his chest, but his hands were steady. He took both of her hands in his, looking into her eyes which were now so familiar and so dear to him. "Emily," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "When I saw you on that porch my heart broke for you. But I see now that it was not an ending. It was a beginning. God brought you here not for Mr. Phelps but for me. You have filled this ranch with a light it was missing. You have filled my heart with a joy I had only prayed for." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Emily. I love your strength, your kindness, and your gentle heart. I want to build a life with you, right here. I want us to be a family, to share our joys and our burdens, and to serve the Lord together. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Emily looked at him, at this good, honest, faithful man who had seen her at her most broken and had offered her not pity, but a hand up. He had given her a home, a purpose, and now he was offering her his whole heart. Her own heart felt so full she thought it might burst. Tears of pure happiness filled her eyes, but this time, they were accompanied by a radiant, joyful smile. "Yes, Timon," she whispered, her voice clear and sure. "Oh yes, I love you too. With all my heart." The wedding was held 2 weeks later in the small, whitewashed church in town. It was not a grand affair, but it was filled with more genuine love and happiness than any grand ballroom could ever hold. Timon's mother beamed with pride. The townspeople, who had heard the story of the abandoned bride and the kind rancher, came to offer their blessings and their welcome. Emily wore a simple, beautiful dress that she and Timon's mother had sewn together, and in her hands she carried a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers picked from the creek bank. They stood before the pastor and pledged their lives to one another, their vows not just promises of love, but promises of faith and partnership, spoken before God and their community. After the celebration, they moved into the main ranch house together as husband and wife. Timon's mother, happy and content, remained in her cottage, a beloved and constant presence in their new life. That first night in their home as husband and wife, they knelt together by their bed and prayed, thanking God for the unexpected path that had led them to each other, and asking for His blessing on their new family. The cold rejection on a neighbor's porch felt like a lifetime ago, a faded memory replaced by the warm, bright reality of a love built on kindness, faith, and a second chance. The first year of marriage for Timon and Emily was a beautiful and gentle tapestry woven with threads of shared labor, quiet devotion, and growing love. The main ranch house, which had once been a place of simple bachelor comfort for Timon, was now transformed into a true home, filled with the scent of Emily's fresh baking and the warmth of her presence. They fell into a natural rhythm, a partnership in every sense of the word. Timon would rise with the sun to tend to the livestock, his steps lighter knowing he would return at midday to a meal shared with his wife. Emily took great joy in managing the home, in planting a new and larger flower garden, and in learning the ways of the ranch from her husband. Their evenings were spent in the soft glow of the lamplight, often reading from the Bible, sharing stories from their day, or simply sitting in a comfortable silence that spoke more of their connection than any words could. Their faith was the cornerstone upon which they built their new life together. They never failed to give thanks for their food, for the health of their animals, and for the blessing of finding one another. They attended church every Sunday without fail, sitting side by side in the pew, their voices joining the hymns. The townspeople who had witnessed the beginning of their unusual story now saw them as a single, united force, a couple whose love and respect for each other was evident in every glance and every small gesture. The memory of Emily's arrival on the stagecoach became a distant, faded picture, replaced by the vibrant reality of her place as Mrs. Emily, a cherished and vital part of the community. One cool spring morning, as the world was waking up from its winter sleep, Emily knew she had special news to share with Timon. She had waited until they had finished their morning prayers after breakfast, the sun streaming brightly into their kitchen. She reached across the table and took his work-roughened hands in her own. "Timon," she said, her voice soft but filled with a luminous joy, "I have been praying about something and now I am sure. The Lord has answered our prayers in a new way. We are going to have a baby." Timon looked at her, his eyes wide. For a moment he was completely still, as if trying to fully grasp the meaning of her words. Then a smile so bright and full of wonder spread across his face. He stood up, his chair scraping gently against the wooden floor, and pulled her into a careful, joyful embrace. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He held her for a long time, both of them feeling the immense magnitude of the blessing they had been given. That day Timon's work on the ranch was done with a newfound energy, a song of praise in his heart for the family God was building under his roof. The months that followed were a time of happy preparation. Timon's mother was overjoyed at the news and spent hours with Emily, sewing tiny clothes and soft blankets for the coming child. Timon, with great care and love, carved a small, sturdy cradle from a piece of fine oak wood, sanding it until it was perfectly smooth. The ranch itself seemed to prosper alongside them, the fields lush and green, the cattle healthy and strong. They often spoke of the future, of the child who would one day run through these fields, of the lessons they would teach them about the land and about faith. Their love for each other deepened, maturing into a profound partnership as they awaited the new life they had created together. The birth of their child came on a peaceful autumn night, when the harvest moon hung large and golden in the sky. The doctor was summoned and Timon's mother was there, a calm and experienced presence. Timon waited anxiously in the main room of the house, praying silently with every breath. After what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, the sound of a baby's strong, healthy cry filled the house. It was the most beautiful sound Timon had ever heard. The doctor emerged, smiling warmly, and told Timon he could go in. There he found Emily, tired but radiant, holding a tiny swaddled bundle in her arms. She looked up at her husband, her eyes shining with tears of pure happiness. "Timon," she said softly, "meet your son." Timon approached slowly, his heart feeling as though it might overflow. He looked down at the perfect little face, at the tiny hands, and felt a love so fierce and protective it took his breath away. He knelt beside the bed, gently touching his son's cheek. "He is a miracle," he whispered. "A perfect gift from God." After a quiet moment of wonder, they decided on a name. They chose to call him Nathaniel, a name that means gift of God, for that is precisely what he was. The story of Timon and Emily did not end there. It was only the beginning of a new and beautiful chapter. The years passed, each one adding its own layer of joy and love to their lives. Nathaniel grew from a baby into a sturdy, curious little boy, with his father's kind eyes and his mother's gentle smile. He followed Timon everywhere, learning the names of the animals and the ways of the land. The ranch was filled with the sounds of a happy, thriving family, a child's laughter, a mother's lullaby, a father's proud storytelling. One sunny afternoon, the whole town gathered for a summer picnic. Timon and Emily were there, watching Nathaniel play with the other children on the green grass. It was then that they saw him, Mr. Phelps, sitting alone on a bench at the edge of the festivities, his face as sour and unhappy as it had been all those years ago. He had no family around him, no one to share his life with. Looking at him, Timon and Emily felt no anger, only a deep, profound sense of pity. They understood that his cruel rejection had been the first, painful step on the path that led them to their incredible happiness. Timon put his arm around Emily, pulling her and Nathaniel close. They were a circle of love, a family built on a foundation of faith, kindness, and a second chance. They had known rejection, but they had chosen love. They had faced loneliness, but they had found companionship. They had trusted in God's plan, even when it seemed mysterious and difficult, and He had woven for them a story more wonderful than any they could have imagined. A story of true love, a growing family, and a forever after filled with blessings. If you enjoyed this story of faith, love, and second chances, consider subscribing to our channel for more heartwarming tales that remind us of the beauty in God's plan. Your support helps us share more stories of hope and redemption. Thank you for listening, and may your own life be filled with such blessings.